John mentioned I'm from Nebraska originally. I'm still there, and some of you know where that is. Some of you don't, but it's actually fits some of the iconic images that you think of the big sky. It's not necessarily flat, but I'm in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is the capital of the state of Nebraska, and the university is there. So it's been a great location all these years for my teaching and living. And now I'm still there. I like to explain that I think I have a sense of identity that means growing up in that place, living in the environment that we learned by family vacations, traveling around in the Vista Cruiser, all across the Midwest, going on camping trips with the family and fishing, hiking, all the usual things that you do, but it ends up putting a sense of a place, how far out things are and when you come back home. Here I am when I'm 3 years old, picking up walnuts in the yard before you can mow the grass. And I'm here with my sisters and my little brother in our Czech costumes. We learned songs from my grandmother in Czech that we sang at the Wilbur Czech Festival. It was a wonderful way for us to learn music and harmony. And I still think the way voices sound together is similar to how I think about colors, how things work. So those family vacations brought us to searching for fossils, petroglyphs, petrified wood, and we were rock hounds. So it gave us a good motivation for getting out in that landscape and finding interesting things that actually I always think are more fascinating than anything I could make, like this Mexican crazy lace agate is so beautiful, and it's kind of hidden and you have to discover these things. And so there's always been this sense of quest in our family. We canoed in the Boundary Waters canoe area in northern Minnesota. And of course I grew up in the 50s, 60s, so there's certainly an aesthetic about that time that is in my works, the kind of modern design and thinking that we were going to be in spaceships, the start of the psychedelic era with posters that were like this design. I had pink and green posters with psychedelic patterns. My first job was actually to be a silkscreen printer at a Halloween factory where we made costumes and masks by silkscreening. So even thinking about those kind of dramatic and strong graphic images done in that printing method was influential. But in our home, we had this Van Gogh book. These are the kind of ornaments that were around that statue of the Virgin Mary. Actually, I stole that from a neighbor and got in trouble about doing it, but I still know why I was so fascinated. It was because of those beautiful elongated lines, and it just felt so right in my hands. My parents did silversmithing and lapidary with all those rocks that we collected, as well as kind of turning it into a family hobby of ornamentation that comes from those beautiful natural forms. My grandparents had a poster of this Japanese print on their wall. So those were things that I think were very influential. And then of course I went to the university and learned art history and found all the artists that I identify with. This is such a small sampling. You know, everybody has big lists of artists that they're influenced by, but I think I'm on the Matisse side of things, the joyous color, pattern, design that way. Sister Corita Kent was really influential when I was in high school, and I took art in all 4 years, even did printmaking in high school, which sparked me to want to do printmaking when I went to the university. And then the printmaking today book by Jules Heller was my textbook when I was a student. And on the cover is Carol Summers woodcuts, a wonderful artist that I still love his work so much, and a very influential and experimental way of printing that I emulate. So I think it's important about the two sides of woodblock printing to kind of follow in this braided stream. I've always identified as a Western woodcut artist, which is the German expressionist side of things with the strong graphic image and evidence of all the tool work of cutting patterns and designs like we see with Kirchner. And then there's the Japanese ukiyo-e block print direction. I'm fascinated by the color design and organization of printing in multiple colors and very efficient way of printing, to have flat colors and less of the gestural work. My work is actually a good cross blending of both sides. I emulate some of the gradations and the bukashi blending that comes from the mokuhanga style of woodblock printing, but I do it in the oil-based method. Here's some of the works that I did in graduate school. I did silkscreen printing and etching. I didn't do woodcut until about 5 years later when I started my first teaching job. So there's still a sense of abstraction that's always been in my work. I was never interested in doing representational work or rendering forms in a three-dimensional space. That just doesn't interest me. But finding flat compositions and designs and pushing shapes around, as you'll see, I'll explain some of that. And here's some more recent works that grew out of all of that early training and influences. Brilliant colors and expansive scale. These prints are fairly large. I always forget the sizes. I don't know if that's really relevant, but scale has been an interesting thing to work at with the woodblock prints. And that's one of the reasons I chose to work in woodcut, because I can make a big mark on a large scale with a big patch of color. So in the studio, I have had lots of different studios over the years, including in graduate school, in a garage that was heated with a wood burning stove, the studio that we built out in the country, and then now at Constellation Studios. But in the upper left, you can see me in high school with a painting, I think it was watercolor, that has an interesting way that the sky is all fragmented. That image was really significant for me at the time. I'm kind of in my ugly duckling stage, but always I knew I was going to be an artist, even before high school. In kindergarten, I knew. So in the studio, what actually happens is what I'm trying to show, if I can find, oh, there. I've had studios out in the country. My husband and I had an acreage 30 miles outside of Lincoln, and we built a studio building there, a metal-sided building. And I worked there, had all my presses. Now everything is consolidated at Constellation Studios. I sold the country home, and I'm living at my loft apartment in Constellation Studios with all my presses in one place now at last. And what I do in the studio, of course, is that I'm carving on wood blocks. I just use 1/4-inch birch plywood, and my carving is kind of rough. I'm not a elegant carver. I gash into the wood and the wood fights back with me, which I kind of relish, because then it keeps my marks more honest and rugged. I now work often with 2 wood blocks to make one image, and they are both like a positive and negative. And you can see this with this image right here from a demonstration. The positive area is the forms, and then the negative areas is the background, but you still have to have the negative areas high in order to print from the relief surface of the wood. I do lots of shortcuts. I don't carve everything away. I can block things out and make selective areas to ink up using a brown paper stencil. That's what you see on the bed of the press in the upper right. That press is holding a wood block that has the stencil on top that leaves different holes. So I do a lot of selective inking. I rarely ever ink up the whole block, which is what people expect of a woodcut. I'm doing it in selective patches to lay as many colors as I can at the beginning against the white of the paper. That way they stay brilliant. Once I take the stencil off, then I can manipulate the ink even further. I use my hands and my fingers and I blend the colors out, and you can see how they kind of have these little sharp shapes from the stencil cut, and I try to hide that by the blending. And that led to all this amazing way to get the gradations and a luminosity. The prints evolve, they develop, and I'm doing a reduction block style. So I'm printing and carving and printing and carving and destroying the block as I go. So there's no way I can do advanced proofing. I'm using only the 2 blocks, but I could always go to a 3rd block if I needed to. But you see at these early stages, it's just patches of color on the print and very subtle suggestions about what the forms are going to be. I really rely on the evolution of the image. And I don't want to know what it's going to look like at the beginning. I want to find out through the making. But I usually have a very strong graphic full-size drawing just done in graphite on paper or Duralar so that I can draw and see what the graphic image will look like. But I never print a black image as strong as the drawing. I let the black areas evolve too through other colors. So here's an image that's, you see the large versions, the front of the print and the back side of the print, and also the sequential layout there is showing those different stages. Maybe I missed a stage, I'm not sure. Sometimes there's so many of them. I don't always document. I just keep evolving and working to what the print needs. This print actually was in an exchange portfolio, so I knew it was going to be in a box and people would see the back side of the print. So I printed on the back with these yellow squares. They had to be reversed also, so I'm playing with the viewer in how they're handling the papers. And I'm doing limited editions. I'm doing all this work to make the print and evolve it. It makes sense to do more than one. Here's a whole edition laid out that was done for an exchange portfolio. And I enjoy seeing the multiple impressions, but actually I use editioning for learning what it is I want to do. I have to print one and then I react to that. I can change the colors. I can figure out the best qualities that I want. It takes me about 7 impressions to really get solidified what it is I like about that stage, and then I go on to the next stages. Usually it takes me about 10 stages, maybe 8 somewhere in there, and maybe another 4 or 5 different stages that I hand print. I don't even bother counting those. I never know how much it's going to take. So I'm showing some of the elements and thinking kind of the design of how I come up with things. I usually make a lot of thumbnail sketches. That's what you see in the small sketches there that are all done on cards that are interchangeable. I can rearrange and look. I don't like to keep a sketchbook. It's too confining. So these cards can have all these doodles and scribbles. They can come from being in a meeting or listening on the telephone, and my hand is always moving and doodling. But I draw as a discipline so that even those little thumbnail sketches can show an evolution, and I find the image that I want to do, and I enlarge it into the full size of the paper so that I have a scale model. Then I do a tracing of that sketch, and that's what goes onto the block. But I see that the elements that I build things from are really a play with shape, a play with the edges and line work, the graphic sensibility that I'm looking at with those elemental drawings. Here, shapes end up suggesting a pile of construction materials, or these other shapes are kind of have a cutout and flipped open like a box. And it's just a way of kind of playing and manipulating and seeing that there's potential image in something as elemental. I'm also very much interested in patterning like you would see in fabric design, weaving, the ikat weaving, and patterns that I can make in all kinds of decorative ways, like marbling. But in nature, you see patterns all the time. I'm fascinated by the silhouette of tree branches on the sky. They always have kind of a rhythm and pattern to them that maybe identifies the type of tree it is. Here's the snow on the ground, and you know with some of these scientific theories that randomness actually ends up having a sense of order. And that concept kind of is very interesting to me. I bought one of these saris in the market in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So those patterning is very interesting. Patterning even in the cut marks that I make with my tools that can decorate a whole surface, or the patterns from Japanese kimono remnants that I collected in Japan. But the paper that I'm printing on ends up acting like a big fabric. It's flexible and floating and on that delicate Japanese papers. So here I'm holding the printout and it acts like that flow of pattern. Here's a couple other images where the patterning is about water or about sound. And because I make prints, and I'm describing to you a really gestural, evolutionary, spontaneous way of working with the wood and printing, it sounds very loose and unexpected, but I get the best thing that happens with printing is a crisp refinement that just printing makes happen. The edges look sharp. The ink is in the paper. There's a refinement that happens by the printing quality that I'm capitalizing on, and I have it elevate my own spontaneous or impatientness with making. So I get the best of everything. Material qualities are something that I'm very interested also, and that leads to ideas that I've developed about the use of wood. Wood has always been something I'm working on with these woodcuts, and it has a presence, a character. It fights with me as I'm carving. These sketches are of wooden structures or apparatus that you might see out in the world, and then you go in the world and you see these incredible, strange things that people have done with wood. This was a fence in western Nebraska where there's no forest around, so all the remnants of wood were necessary to make that fence. So I've done series of prints over the years that actually have maybe an emblematic form of the tree or the branches. In this instance of these prints, one has the branches more sharp and angular, geometric, and the other, the branches are flowing. So I'm contrasting the two as a way of indicating nature versus man-made control, pruning, trimming, all those devices to constrain form. Yet it's actually elegant and beautiful also. And then the other material consciousness that I work with is the idea of the paper itself. Paper has a characteristic, and right from the start when I started working, I was interested in exploring all those unusual Japanese papers that could be found, like this cherry paper, made paper, handmade paper. They all have a characteristic like you see in this paper wasp nest. some natural quality that contributes. I don't want to always cover up the paper. I have a private game to leave empty spaces of the paper visible, so it has a sense that's different than printed ink, and the two contrast with each other. Here in this work, I've actually played with printing and drawing on front and back of the sheet, and the translucency and light comes. They're hung in an installation fashion, so it ends up making a giant accordion fold book on the wall, as well as a bound book. This collaboration with Helen Hebert, a paper maker, she made watermarks in the paper itself, and then my images are printing and interacting with that qualities of light within the paper. And these prints are some of the largest ones I've done quite recently. They're hanging, you maybe behind me, you can see one. And I'm looking at one here in the gallery. They're, I think they're 76 inches tall by maybe 24 inches wide. Beautiful paper. I love the decal edges. I don't cut them off. So the scale of the print actually, and the paper becomes very engaging and something that I want to honor. And that leads to the idea of space. So I'm describing that some prints always have a spatial aspect where it's the white of the paper. That lends itself a kind of an ambiguity about the space, like you see in these images of landscape. Is that water or is it the sky? It could be actually some of both, and that illusion is very interesting and kind of funny and illogical. And I like that ambiguous quality of the space that I can build in the compositions. The untouched parts of the paper end up creating a sense of space. I didn't do anything to the big white area below these island forms. And so I'm hinting at space and also denying it, not putting a little bit of a shadow or glow on something that is the white of the paper, creating a flip-flop of the space moving in and out. In the print Twain on the right, that's like elemental square blocks, and they're permutating into the natural forms of the leaves. So I've been very interested in the artist's book and making books myself, and I think it comes from being fascinated by illuminated manuscripts and what they served as a precious object and relic. And they're so gorgeous and ornamented, over the top ornamented. So I kind of aspire to doing that same thing with my own artist books. My artist books have etching, woodcuts. Sometimes they're mixed up in the same print. I, again, print on front and back. I don't often write for the poems or the text that's there. I find a poem or I work with the poet, but I do write for the titles for all my prints. So on the left, you can see a group of writings that are working at finding just the right combination of words that say a big idea in a very concise way. Well, that's the function of poetry anyway. So I think all my titles are very interesting and work that way. I work at making those titles. So the artist books and my vocabulary of images actually present another language, but there's lots of other languages and ways of writing and symbology that we know exist out in the world, including this image of the seismograph from a volcano, that's on the left, or now we have the invisible rays or whatever they're going through us that can allow us to get messages through space. And we have all these towers that are providing that. What kind of symbol system is going forth that's even passing through us? We're all wearing our phones on our bodies, so somehow those marks are coming through us. So I think of my mark making and design symbols are in some ways another verbal, non-verbal language. I use a lot of things over and over again, but always in a new way. there's lots of circles in my work. I'm not sure exactly what they mean. Somebody might ask that question, but they do something. They have an energy field about them and they interact together. So I make one-of-a-kind books also. Some of those have been carved and printed within the wood block itself. This one had little inclusions of precious gems. So bookmaking has been a very interesting parallel side. Maybe it's one of these streams that are very interesting for me to work with. Here's the latest one that has etchings and little poems by Kandinsky. So I've taught for many years. John Mark explained that. I've taught for 40 years or so, and now I'm retired. But as a teacher, as an artist who moves around the world, I feel like I'm an observer. I'm trying to see what's out there, making things happen for other people, and I'm observing my students and little pushes or comments. It ends up creating something special and engaging. And I have always enjoyed that interaction and the amazing opportunities that I've had. Sometimes when I'm in these exotic locations, it filters back through me. And maybe that's important for me to know my role as this absorbing filter, and then out it comes through the art. Somehow those colors just flowed when I was in Egypt. This is along the Nile River in Minya. And they had one of the world's largest cemeteries on the other side of the Nile River with these beehive tombs. And here's the print that I made in Egypt. Again, a kind of a group of powerful circles and images of breath. This was a series that I did in Venice, Italy, and they immediately absorbed the sense of water. That's why I went there. I wanted to go and experience not the landlocked place that I'm always in, but someplace different and see how being around water felt. It made some very large, beautiful prints that are here in this exhibition. And on my last sabbatical, I went to Washington, D.C. and visited the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian Institution libraries and did sketches and studies in those great reading rooms, looking at incunabula books and drawing from some of the technological images so that I could see what was the technology of the day in those very early years. You see some of these symbols that then I adopted, I drew in my sketchbook, and they came filtered out into this series of prints. I was looking at other technological forms and being very open-minded with how I did the additions. They all had variations to them and combined etching and woodcut and even some watercolor painting. And I exhibited them like book pages also. So the big idea that I think colors all my work is the idea of transformation, the change that's potential in everything, and how does that change happen? It could be immediate and disastrous, like we know from natural occurrences, the tornadoes, the big storms that we're all I'm a weather nut. I like to listen to the weather all the time, and it helps us know what to anticipate and think about, but something could dramatically change, or maybe it's evolutionary pace. This series of prints actually dealt with some of those ideas. What were the elements at the beginning of time and the little creatures that were floating around in the landscape, turning into something? Or the noise of echoing that's being pounded into the ocean while they're doing research to test for oil shales or something under the ocean. So some of those ecological issues are a subtext to these prints. The man-made versus the natural, organic versus geometric, light versus dark, intense color versus subtle colors. All of those things actually end up having meaning about the idea of transformation and time. these are the most recent prints that I just finished. I'm kind of calling it the curtain series. They have other smaller components that go with these large curtain prints. They're back here in the gallery behind me. And I'm thinking they're my pandemic responses, even though I hate to tie myself to a specific theme and time, but it's about that waiting. We've all been waiting. What happens when things change? What happens when we're in this tension of the moment? And what happens on the other side? I'm kind of thinking of that idea, and this idea spins into the microscopic. It goes down to looking at even the patterns that would be in a curtain, and it has the architecture around it. So it's really a kind of meaningful idea for me about loss and the stage that we're in, about all this passing humanity and the time. And as an artist, we all have a duty, I think, that to make some presence known. Maybe that's the human nature, to find out what we do and what we leave behind, like these wooden votives from Roman era or the rocks on the beach. They're not going to last very long. But I think being an artist, you have that power to change raw materials into something. And that's the text of this book here, the meaning of all these hand gestures that are forming, almost like clay. And the possibility that we all do as humans on the earth, making all these disasters, as well as beautiful disasters, like toxic spills and oil spills that are happening, that you hear in the news all the time. What's the next disaster that's going to happen? So to end here with a few images of Constellation Studios, I bought a building in, I bought a building 8 years ago and had it renovated. It's a storefront at 21st and O Street in Lincoln. So it's on the east side of downtown. And it's a beautiful space. I still have some renovations to do and work, but it has a gallery space on the main floor and the presses, and it has a full basement that has a bookmaking area, print storage, my type collection, and paper making studios. And I intend this space to be a community print center with local artists that are members, as well as artists who come for residencies. It's been amazing to use the space for all these experimental things or invitations for exhibitions of other artists whose work I've admired. We created this big collaborative project with over 250 artists sending a work to make a huge accordion fold book that ended up getting exhibited in Venice, Italy. Here's some of the artists, including John Mark, showing, being artists in residence in the space and working alongside me in the studio. It's really been a fascinating way. You're all invited. Please come see me there. It's meant to be a long-term project. I don't ever want to move my presses again. They're all in one place now, and I'm working there too on my press. So it's been an amazing project to do and has a lot of room for growth. And I'm doing it at a slow pace because it's what I can manage. I don't have staff. I have assistants who can help at times, but not continually. So it's kind of what I can manage. It's a beautiful space. So come and see me, and I would welcome your questions. Please send them out. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, Karen, looks like we have a question from Anne Rainierson.
Okay.
And should I tell
Stop
you?
sharing. So
I'll tell you.
There.
So she's wondering about your move to Lincoln from your rural home and how it's changed your approach to themes within your work, and also how you deal with registration when printing multiple layers.
Okay, the technical question is pretty easy to answer. I have marks that are on the back of my paper, and they match marks that are drawn on the block the wood block. And all those registration marks are on a piece of tracing paper that I can trace to any number of blocks that I want. So I can always match up the registration marks. The blocks are larger than the paper. And then moving to Lincoln and living there permanently and letting go of my country home has been actually very difficult and sad. I lost my husband in 2019, and I had to make big life decisions on my own. That was pretty hard, but I knew I couldn't live out there in the country by myself and manage that space. We had 7 acres, so it was a lot to deal with. And living in town, I think right away I was worried, would I be able to make art again? But that curtain series came from it. And I think it was an important response to this new life change and even my in-between status. Where was I? Where am I? What am I going to make? Those are the questions that everybody has about life. Thanks.
So Melanie has a question. What inspired you to get into bookmaking? Do you plan on making many more books on a large scale?
Am I still? Yeah. I've made artist books ever since I was a graduate student, actually, so that's a long time. About every 2 years, I make a major, for me, a major production of a book, but they're what I can manage. They're usually soft covers. They are not a big, hard, heavy bound book that takes so many pages. Often my structure is an accordion fold book so that things open out and can have a visibility. And then they have the compression and the tactility of holding this small collection in your hands. I think my bookmaking is getting more and more formal over all these years, but I know I have to keep doing it. It's really an enjoyable alternative to these giant prints to have this collection that the book represents. I feel like they have, an idea becomes more full. It's worked more fully because I have many images with it. I have some other words that go with it. It's my excuse to do letterpress printing, which I love to do. And they're alternative formats that I'm learning, so I'll keep making them. Any more questions? Oh, look.
So one of the things I want to ask you is after hearing your talk, wonderful talk, by the way. I guess I haven't seen all of that. So. Yeah, and it strikes me in looking at the development of your work, how incredibly inventive and prolific you are. I'm amazed at all the durations and the development of your imagery over time. And I'm really interested in the way you work and the fact that you're working in prints and the evolution of your process, like how you work, how you wrestle the image out in that process. I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit about how you find the images through the process of wood carving, of making prints.
Yeah, I could start by saying, I think I'm not so prolific, but time has added it up. So yeah, now there's a lot of work. All these years, I've always thought that if I made 8 editions a year, that's pretty good. Some years there hasn't been that much, and other years I might do a series of monoprints, and then you get a lot of mileage out of those. So it's been consistent, and I'm a pretty driven artist. So somehow I managed to do the art in between teaching and commuting, traveling. All of those things ended up interfering, but I've been able to sustain an idea of a print because it might take me over a month to finish something. So even that idea that I'm sustaining interest and not losing or quitting or taking it to the dead end it ends up being a very interesting thing that I can swell it up when I need it. Because sometimes life comes along and you can't actually get to things. But over the years, people probably can analyze it and say, what's changed in Karen's work? And color, everybody always remarks about that, that's one thing. I think the colors are a little less primary than they were at one time, and now they're more nuanced and a lot more subtleties, I think. I can't predict which way it's going to go, and sometimes I don't. But I think working for me has always been my sense of release. If I am frustrated with all the other stuff, if I can always keep working on something, then that satisfies a little bit of the sense of frustration, and I can handle all kinds of stress if I can get into the studio. I don't know if that answers that as well. Yeah, but how to juggle those things.
Yes, it does. It looks like we have about 5 minutes left, so we have a couple other questions. One from Elizabeth. Has traditional Czech folk art or material culture influenced you?
Probably in some ways. Folk art in all different cultures has always influenced me, because I'm always search for how wood is used. So if it's a wooden boat rotting on the shoreline in Finland, I've seen that, or the museums that have carved wooden artifacts from 2,000 years ago in Egypt, or the patterning in all kinds of folk arts and textile arts. Those things are always interesting to me. And I did grow up with the Czech heritage as well as the German side, but the Czech was really very special, and there were immigrants that came directly to Nebraska, and in their little villages they spoke Czech. My dad grew up speaking Czech, but when he went to school he had to lose it. But they were all born in the United States, so even that awareness of that background, and that our immigrant ancestors chose to come. I've stood in their little village in Czech Republic and saw the house they left and asked those questions myself. Why? Why would they have left? Well, they had 12 children. What are you going to do? You had to come where there was space. So all those things do influence the question about where you're from and what are you doing in these places.
Okay, so I think we have time for another question. This is from Terry. She asks, so she says, printmaking has changed so much lately in order to make the processes safer for the artist and the environment. Can you talk about this?
Well, of course, I'm very much interested in all those ideas for safer printmaking and using less of the solvents, and actually having lived through the days when we love to laugh about how the studios were when we were young, people doing all kinds of bad stuff. And we've certainly cleaned things up and done so much better. But there are certain aspects that I believe are so strong and have such a heritage, I don't want to give them up. And that, of course, is using oil-based ink. I don't think that water-based inks can match it. And oil-based ink is the same thing as paint with a pigment and a binder. So it just lends the luminosity to my work. And I've compared it. I've done some water-based things, and some of it can almost equal it, but so I'm compensating in all the other ways of being healthy and archival, doing those cleanup methods. And I'm actually a pretty clean printmaker. My hands don't get that dirty, and not like in the old days. I'm doing relief printing, so you have a tool that you're applying the ink instead of wiping plates. But so
and you're using your hands when you're printing.
Yeah.
And they still don't get that dirty. I don't understand that. But
no, because I'm always wiping it off, and the inks actually are quite transparent. And the transparency that I'm adding to the ink ends up helping that luminosity as well, and the cleaning up ability. So that's a good thinking.
Well, I think we're about out of time. So I want to thank Karen for her presentation and for her visit here to Hamlin. We really enjoyed having her here, and
Thanks, everybody.
thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, if you're in town, please come and see the show. It's open to visitors. Just make sure you wear a mask when you're here. And the gallery's open from 10 to 4, Monday through Friday. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me. I'm easy to find on the Hamlin website. I'm John Rexlink again. And so just shoot me an email, and I'm happy to answer any questions about visiting and that kind of stuff. Right?
Great.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Great to see you. Thanks. Let me see.
All right, so we can.